Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into Bitcoin's roots. Satoshi Nakamoto's original white paper.
Right, the foundation.
Exactly. And then we're going to see how that stacks up against XRP, or Ripple, as many call it. We've got a bunch of sources lined up.
Yeah, the white paper itself, of course, but also some video breakdowns, Investopedia, Reddit threads digging into the tech side.
Gordon Law Group on the whole SEC legal battle, xrpl.org, info, BitChit, MoonPay. Quite a mix.
It is. The idea is to really get the core concepts right. Understand Bitcoin's original goal for electronic cash, and then see how something like XRP takes a different path.
And hopefully you listening will get a really solid grasp of these two, the mechanics, the differences, maybe some surprises, without needing a PhD in cryptography.
Exactly. Think of it as your quick but thorough guide, skipping the fluff, getting to the heart of it.
Okay, let's jump right in. Bitcoin's white paper. What was the big problem Satoshi was trying to fix back then?
Well, the paper really focuses on the problems with using trusted third parties for online payments, banks, payment processors.
The middleman.
Right. Satoshi argued that relying on trust has built-in weaknesses. Like, you can't really have truly non-reversible transactions because these institutions have to mediate disputes.
Chargebacks and stuff.
Exactly. And that mediation, it adds costs. It makes small, casual transactions kind of impractical. Plus, needing trust means merchants get wary, they need more info from customers, they accept a certain level of fraud.
Yeah.
It all adds friction.
So the trust itself was the weak link, causing costs and complexity. What was Bitcoin's answer then?
A totally different model, an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof, not trust.
Cryptographic proof.
Yeah.
Meaning math, basically.
Yeah, essentially. The goal was direct peer-to-peer payments online, cutting out the intermediary entirely, making transactions computationally hard to reverse, protecting sellers, maybe even enabling things like basic escrow without a third party.
Okay, but the huge challenge there is double spending, right? How do you stop someone spending the same digital coin twice if there's no central bank watching?
That was the core problem to solve in a decentralized way. And the solution proposed was pretty ingenious. A peer-to-peer distributed timestamp server.
A distributed timestamp server. What does that actually mean in practice?
Think of it like a public ledger. The network takes recent transactions, bundles them into a block, and then performs a kind of a computational puzzle proof of work to seal that block.
Okay.
Then that block gets added to a chain of previous blocks, creating a historical record. Each block is timestamped and linked to the previous one using cryptography.
So it's a chain of blocks, a blockchain.
Precisely. And because changing any past block would require redoing the difficult proof of work for that block and all the blocks after it, it becomes incredibly hard to tamper with the history. The longest chain is considered the valid one because it represents the most computational work.
So the security comes from the combined computing power of the network, making it too hard for any one person to cheat the system.
That's the idea. The white paper lays out these key concepts. An electronic coin is just a chain of digital signatures showing ownership changes.
Right.
We talked about double spending, why a central mint isn't ideal for peer-to-peer. So you need public transactions, everyone sees them, and a way for everyone to agree on the order they happened in. That's the timestamp server's job.
And this timestamp server isn't one computer, it's the whole network doing this proof of work thing.
Yes, exactly. It's implemented using proof of work, kind of like Adam Back's Hashcash idea. Nodes basically crunch numbers, trying to find a specific value a nonce that, when hashed with the block's data, gives a result with a certain pattern, like a bunch of leading zeros.
Finding that nonce is the work. It takes effort.
A lot of trial and error computational effort, yes. Electricity, processing cycles. Once found, that block is effectively sealed. Changing anything inside would break the proof. You'd have to find a new nonce all over again.
And the more blocks get added on top, the harder it becomes to go back and change an old one.
Exponentially harder. Makes it practically impossible after a while.
Okay, that makes sense. The white paper also mentions one CPU, one vote. What's that about? Is it still relevant?
It was about trying to make the consensus process fair, linking influence to computing power. The idea was to prevent someone creating lots of fake nodes, a Sybil attack, to dominate the network. One CPU doing the work equals one vote towards which chain is valid.
So the longest chain wins because it has the most votes or work behind it.
Right. The assumption was that honest nodes collectively would have more CPU power than any attacker. Now things have evolved with specialized hardware, ASICs, which concentrate mining power more.
Ah, right. So it's not strictly one CPU anymore.
No, not really. But the principle of linking consensus weight to invested computational effort remains central to Bitcoin's security model.
And the system adjusts how hard that puzzle is, right? So blocks don't come too fast or too slow.
Correct. It's called the difficulty adjustment. If blocks are being found faster than the target, which is about every 10 minutes for Bitcoin, the puzzle gets harder. If they're too slow, it gets easier. It keeps the block production rate relatively stable over time, regardless of how much total computing power is on the network.
So let's trace a transaction. I want to send Bitcoin. I broadcast it.
Yep, it goes out to the network nodes.
Nodes collect recent transactions into a potential block. Then they race to solve that proof of work puzzle for their block.
Right, competing to find that valid nonce.
The winner broadcasts their solved block. Other nodes check it. Are the transactions valid? Is the proof of work correct?
Exactly. They verify everything.
And if it's all good, they add it to their copy of the chain, always building on the longest one they see.
That's the cycle. Propose, verify, extend. Continuously.
What's the motivation for these nodes, the miners, to do all this work?
The incentive. It's built in. The first transaction in every new block is special. It creates brand new Bitcoin out of thin air and gives it to the node that found the block.
The block reward, like mining for gold.
Precisely. That's the primary incentive historically. The white paper also foresaw that as the block reward diminishes over time, which it's designed to do, transaction fees paid by users could become the main incentive for miners.
Okay, ingenious. But doesn't this blockchain get massive, storing every single transaction forever?
That's where Merkle trees come in. It's a clever way to summarize all the transactions in a block into a single cryptographic fingerprint, the Merkle root, which goes in the block header.
So you keep the summary, but not necessarily all the old details.
Right. Once a transaction is buried under many subsequent blocks, you can actually discard the old transaction data itself to save space. You just need the block headers, which contain the Merkle roots, to maintain the integrity and proof of the entire chain.
So nodes don't have to store everything.
Full nodes generally do for maximum security and network participation. But there's also something called simplified payment verification, SPV.
SPV, what's that?
It lets users, like on a mobile wallet, verify their own transactions without downloading the entire blockchain. They just need the block headers and the specific branch of the Merkle tree that connects their transaction to the root in a header.
Sounds efficient. Any drawbacks?
Well, the white paper notes it relies on the honesty of the network's full nodes. An attacker with enough network power could potentially trick an SPV client, though it's generally considered secure enough for most uses.
What about privacy? Bitcoin transactions are public, but are they anonymous?
It's often called pseudonymous. The transactions are public on the blockchain, linked Bitcoin addresses, which are like public keys, but those addresses aren't inherently tied to your real-world identity.
So somewhat private, but not totally anonymous.
Exactly. The paper suggests using a new address for every transaction to improve privacy. But it also points out that if you combine funds from multiple addresses in one transaction, it can link those addresses together, potentially revealing they belong to the same entity.
Okay. And finally, Satoshi went into some deep math about attacks, right? Binomial random walks, gambler's ruin. What was the takeaway?
The core point was to show mathematically why it's incredibly unlikely an attacker could succeed in rewriting the blockchain history, like reversing a payment they made.
How so?
It assumes the honest network has more computing power overall. The probability of an attacker creating a longer fraudulent chain drops exponentially with every new block the honest network adds on top of the transaction.
So the longer you wait for confirmations, more blocks added after yours, the safer you are.
Exactly. The gambler's ruin analogy says the attacker, gambler with less money power, is overwhelmingly likely to fail against the house, the honest network with more power over time. The math provides a strong, probabilistic guarantee of security, getting stronger with each confirmation.
Wow, okay. That's a fantastic overview of Bitcoin's original design and thinking. Really groundbreaking stuff. Now, let's pivot to XRP. What's its main goal, according to our sources?
XRP is positioned quite differently. It's really designed for faster and cheaper payments, especially aimed at businesses, financial institutions. It's the native token for the XRP ledger.
So less about peer-to-peer cash for everyone, more focus on the existing financial system.
That seems to be the primary use case highlighted, yeah. optimizing how money moves globally, particularly across borders.
And when you put them side by side, the differences really jump out. Transaction speed, for instance.
Huge difference. Bitcoin, we said maybe 10 minutes average, but it can get clogged up and take much longer.
Right.
XRP, most sources say 3 to 5 seconds for confirmation. Very, very fast in comparison. That's a major selling point for its target use case.
And costs. Bitcoin fees can be unpredictable, sometimes really high. XRP.
Extremely low. Investopedia mentions a standard cost of like 0.000001 XRP, a tiny fraction of a cent. And that fee is actually destroyed, burned, slightly reducing the supply. Even when Bitcoin fees spiked, XRP stayed negligible.
Okay, speed and costs clearly favor XRP there.
Yeah.
But what about decentralization? That seems to be a big point of contrast.
Definitely. Bitcoin is generally seen as highly decentralized. No single company, community-driven development, distributed mining. XRP, well, it's often described as more centralized. It was created by a company, Ripple Labs. They still hold a lot of XRP, and while the ledger is maintained by the XRPL Foundation now, Ripple's influence is still seen as significant.
The Reddit threads got into this quite a bit, didn't they? Talking about XRP's consensus mechanism. It's not mining like Bitcoin.
No, it uses something different, sometimes called Federated Byzantine Agreement-like, or the XRP Ledger Consensus Protocol. Basically, a set of trusted validators vote on transactions.
Trusted validators. Who chooses them?
Different network participants maintain lists of validators they trust, called unique node lists, or UNLs. For a transaction to be confirmed, a supermajority, like 80% of these validators, need to agree on its validity and order within a few seconds.
So it's based on trust in these validators, not raw computing power.
In a sense, yes. It's much more energy efficient than Bitcoin's proof of work, but it leads to those centralization concerns. Some Redditors worried about how small the group of key validators might be, or pointed to past temporary outages.
But there were counterarguments on Reddit too, right? People saying the XRPL is decentralized to a degree.
Yes, users like arg0fs argued that it is a distributed ledger, and crucially, users can choose their own trusted validator lists. You aren't forced to use Ripple's list, for example.
So there's some user choice there in defining trust.
There is. But still, the origins with Ripple Labs and their large holdings mean it occupies a very different spot on the decentralization spectrum compared to Bitcoin's more organic, leaderless emergence.
Okay, and this difference feeds into their main uses cases too. Bitcoin as digital gold, a store of value, maybe a medium of exchange, plus things like Lightning. What about XRP?
XRP's design points squarely at cross-border payments, being a bridge currency, providing liquidity for financial institutions, making international transfers faster and cheaper than traditional systems like SWIFT. That's the consistent theme.
Supply is another obvious difference. Bitcoin's hard cap of 21 million. XRP.
Much larger. 100 billion XRP were created initially. That's a huge difference in scale.
And Ripple, holding a lot of that, initially caused some debate, though much is in circulation now.
Right. Concerns were raised about Ripple releasing XRP from escrow over time, potentially affecting the price. Bitcoin's fixed, predictable supply contributes to its store of value narrative.
We touched on energy uses. Bitcoin's proof of work is intensive. XRP's consensus is not.
Yeah, massive difference there. XRP's energy consumption is negligible, which is often highlighted as a major advantage.
Investopedia also listed some other tech differences. Different crypto algorithms.
Yep. Bitcoin mainly SHA-256, ECDSA. XRP Ledger uses SHA-512. At a DSA, also ECDSA, different cryptographic toolkits.
An XRP ledger can handle tokenization natively, like creating tokens for other assets.
Correct. Accounts on the XRP ledger can issue tokens representing various assets, whereas Bitcoin itself is primarily just for Bitcoin, although layers on top of Bitcoin are now enabling more complex things.
In scalability, XRP was designed for higher throughput.
Seems so. XRPL.org claims it can handle 1,500 transactions per second on regular hardware. Bitcoin's base layer capacity is much lower. Those solutions like Lightning aim to address that. Again, different design priorities.
It really highlights the trade-offs, doesn't it? Bitcoin prioritizing decentralization and security, perhaps at the cost of speed and base layer scalability. XRP prioritizing speed and cost for payments, making different choices on decentralization.
Absolutely. Different tools for potentially different jobs.
Okay, we absolutely have to talk about the regulatory side with XRP, the whole SEC lawsuit. What's the story there?
Right, the elephant in the room. The SEC sued Ripple Labs back in December 2020.
What was the core accusation?
They allege that Ripple conducted a massive, unregistered securities offering by selling XRP. They claimed Ripple raised over $1.3 billion this way since 2013 without registering XRP as a security.
And it wasn't just the company, but executives too.
Yes. The SEC also alleged that co-founder Chris Larson and CEO Brad Garlinghouse personally sold about $600 million worth of XRP, also unregistered, and even XRP given out for services was part of this alleged unregistered offering.
But then there was a big court ruling in July 2023. That wasn't a clear win for the SEC, was it?
No, it was seen as a split decision, maybe more favorable to Ripple overall. Judge Torres ruled that XRP itself isn't necessarily a security.
Okay.
But she distinguished how it was sold. Sales directly from Ripple to institutional investors. Those were deemed unregistered securities offerings because those buyers likely expected profit based on Ripple's efforts.
The Howey test factors.
Exactly. But sales of XRP on public exchanges, programmatic sales, she ruled those were not securities offerings in that context because buyers didn't necessarily know they were buying from Ripple and didn't have the same expectations tied directly to Ripple's work.
So a partial win for Ripple on the exchange sales, but a loss on the direct institutional sales.
Pretty much.
But the SEC wasn't happy with that ruling on exchange sales, were they?
No, they filed an appeal in October 2024, specifically challenging the part about programmatic sales not being securities. They still argue those, and XRP used for compensation, should count as securities offerings. Ripple's response is due around April 2025.
And the Gordon Law article mentioned potential shifts at the SEC itself post-election.
Right. With the change in administration, Gary Gensler is out as chair, Mark Ieta is acting chair, and Paul Atkins, seen as more crypto-friendly or favoring clearer rules over just enforcement, is nominated. Plus, they've formed a dedicated crypto task force led by Hester Pierce, aiming to develop a proper regulatory framework. Some recent moves like pausing the Binance case, and talks between senators and industry. It all hints at maybe a less confrontational approach from the SEC going forward.
So speculation is that this could even affect the Ripple appeal. Maybe they drop it.
That's the speculation some observers have, yeah. A move away from regulation by enforcement.
What would that mean if the SEC dropped the appeal?
It would be pretty significant. It would essentially let the judge's ruling stand that programmatic sales of XRP aren't securities offerings. That could provide some much-needed clarity, not just for XRP, but potentially for how other digital assets sold on exchanges are viewed.
A big deal for the industry, potentially.
Could be, yeah. A potential shift towards clearer rules rather than lawsuits deciding everything. It would reduce a major cloud hanging over XRP.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we started with Bitcoin's vision. Peer-to-peer electronic cash, decentralized, secured by proof of work, solving double spending without banks.
Right, a fundamental rethink of digital money.
Then we contrasted it with XRP, focused on fast, cheap payments, especially for institutions, using a different consensus model, leading to debates about its decentralization, but clear advantages in speed and cost.
Yep, very different designs, different goals.
And layered on top of XRP is this major regulatory uncertainty, the SEC case, which highlights the broader challenge of fitting crypto into existing financial regulations.
Absolutely. That case is a focal point for the whole industry's struggle with unclear rules.
So choosing between them really depends on what you value most, doesn't it? Decentralization versus speed, store of value versus payment efficiency.
Precisely. There are trade-offs inherent in each design. And as the SEC situation shows, the regulatory landscape is a massive factor influencing everything.
It leaves us with a lot to think about. So here's something for you, our listeners, to mull over. We've seen these trade-offs. Decentralization, speed, cost. Bitcoin and XRP represent two different points on that spectrum. What kind of innovations do you think might come next? Could we see something that effectively bridges these gaps, offering the best of both worlds? Or maybe entirely new ways to handle digital value?
And alongside the tech, how critical will regulatory clarity be? Will clear rules finally unlock the next wave of development, or will the uncertainty continue to shape which projects thrive and which struggle? Really makes you think about where this is all heading.